Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to coverage of round 22 of the Zurich 1953 Candidates Tournament. There's a lot of fighting chess in this round. Four of the 7 games were decisive, and of the draws, there were a few fighting draws in there as well. So some interesting games that could have gone either way. The game I've selected, before that I wanted to mention one game. The game Najdorf against Averbach for fans of positional chess is a great one to look at. Averbach with the black pieces plays the Queen's Indian defense and aims throughout the middle game to get a particular endgame where he has a good knight against a bad bishop. And then the endgame with knight and rook against bishop and rook, he manages to win in nice style. So good game to look at for your own interest. And this game here, however, was perhaps the most instructive game of the tournament. In Bronstein's commentary on this game, it extends over 7 pages, which is really quite a lot considering that the book has to cover over 200 games. So he really spent a lot of time dissecting this game, and it has 2 interesting ideas in it that you might want to look for as I go through the game. The first is in the middle game, it's play against the isolated queen's pawn. And in the end game, it's a very interesting rook and pawn endgame with 4 pawns against 3 pawns. So those are the highlights of the game. Let's talk about the players. With the white pieces, we have Svetozar Gligoric. He's a Serbian grandmaster, Yugoslavian. And here's a picture of him from the time of the tournament, 1953. He was a very popular grandmaster. He played at all the tournaments and was friendly with everyone. His saying was, "I play the pieces," rather than, somebody asked him, I guess, how he would play against this person or that person. He says he doesn't play against a person. He plays the pieces. He plays the position on the board. So Max Euwe, his opponent, is from the Netherlands, a former world champion. And let's see, here's a picture of him taken in 1935 from the time of the World Championship. And then here's another picture, 1953, from the time of the tournament. So that's what he looked like at that time. He's had pretty good form at the start of the tournament, but he kind of faltered towards the end. So the 2 of these players are not in contention for the top spots, but they're still fighting for pride and the love of the game. So they put on a pretty good show here. Svetozar kicks off with d4, and Euwe responds with knight f6. We get a Nimzo Indian defense, which was very popular, one of the top openings in this tournament, and the Rubinstein variation with e3. So we get the standard position here. I'm not going to talk about the opening too much, so I have time to talk about some of the other features. But black goes ahead and counters in the center, mobilizing all of his pawns. And white just develops his pieces naturally, both sides castle. And right here is the first decision. You could play a move like a3, just kick the bishop and continue from there. And that's probably a decent way to play. But white decides at this point that he can saddle black with an isolated queen's pawn, and he proceeds to do that. So d takes, e takes, and d takes, bishop takes. So now black has the isolated queen's pawn. And all the pieces are still on. Notice there's 4 minor pieces, 2 rooks, and a queen. And the strategy here is that the isolated queen's pawn is an advantage in a dynamic sense. It controls squares in the center. It provides outposts for the pieces. It provides a couple of open files for the rooks. So it's good in a dynamical sense for black. But in the long run, it's a weakness. And at some point, black would like to just push this pawn forward to d4 and dissolve it against this e-pawn here. And that would also open up more squares for his own pieces. So it's also an aggressive attacking move, not just getting rid of a weakness. So that's always in the position. And so white's plan from this point of view is to restrain the pawn, prevent it from coming forward. and trade off all the minor pieces and get into a situation where he just has the heavy pieces operating against the pawn. And then it's not so much of a strength and more of a weakness, that it becomes a target that can be attacked. So that's the plans for the two opposing sides. Gligoric here starts off with a3. Bronstein points out he could have played an alternate plan with b3. I think Bronstein preferred this one slightly, where after b3, a6, play might go like this. The point of a6 is to allow the bishop to drop back, and then bishop to b2. So this is a way of getting the bishop on this diagonal, and we have restrained the pawn. This knight is going to get back into the game, possibly via the c4, c5 square after the rook comes to c1. We'll see some of these ideas in the game. Gligoric is playing with a lot of the same ideas. He's just doing it in a slightly different way. So he kicks off with a3, and black plays a6. And now he proceeds with b4, again kicking that bishop, but this time doing it with the pawn. And the pawn here is going to provide support for an outpost of a knight on the c5 square, so that's what white's idea is. Now black plays the move bishop d6. And this was criticized. Bronstein prefers the move bishop to a7, staying on this diagonal. Let's erase that arrow. If the bishop is on a7, it's staying on this diagonal. And what that does is it helps control the square in front of the d-pawn and maybe supports the idea of pushing the d-pawn forward at some point. So it is in some ways a more logical placement for the bishop. But Euwe has a specific idea for this bishop, and we'll see that in a few moves. So bishop to b2, just continuing with this plan, indirectly restraining the pawn and putting the bishop on a good diagonal. Now bishop to g4 was played, maybe trying to restrain this knight a bit. Rook to c1, putting rook on the open file. Bishop to c7. Now we see what black's plan is. He's maneuvered his bishop back to c7 so that he can place his queen here and threaten checkmate. A simple plan, but it's going to cause some weaknesses in white's camp. White continues with knight a4. The knight's heading for that juicy c5 square. The queen goes to d6, threatening, cancel that, threatening the mate. And white defends with g3, just blocking it. So now these guys are pretty well shut down, but it did create a weakness. There are holes here. But there's no immediate way to exploit the holes. So, for example, if the bishop were to come here, this wasn't played, but the rook just goes to e1, and there's no big follow-up. I guess you would try a move like knight g4 here next, but you can get into trouble pretty quickly. Yeah, knight g5 starts to cause problems because knight g5 is a double attack on the queen and the knight, and the queen's not yet over on this side of the board where it can help. So these attacking moves are just not working at this point. Black continues with the move knight to e4. Well, that's a good post for the knight, so he's getting something out of this, but he's not immediately able to exploit these weaknesses that he created. So white continues with his plan, plays knight c5, and now at this point Euwe decides he needs to exchange off this knight. This knight is becoming a bit of a menace over here. If he were to play something like bishop to c8, I mean the knight, cancel that, the knight was attacking the the knight was attacking the pawn on b7, so dropping the bishop back to defend the pawn is one way to play this if you're not going to take the knight off. And then bishop to d3, putting some pressure on the knight, and white has a decent game here. So at this point, Euwe decided just to trade off this knight. So the knight goes, takes with the rook, and maybe he's hoping to get some play against this rook at some point, prove that it's in an awkward spot. He starts by putting his rook to d8, just more force behind the d-pawn. He still has ideas of pushing this pawn forward at some point. And now knight to d4 is played, so really putting a stop to any idea of advancing the d-pawn, just firmly blockading it for the moment, and also encouraging another exchange. There's no great squares for this bishop, so it just gets traded off here. And so two of the minor pieces have gone. So in a way, White is already halfway towards his goal. He wants to get rid of all the minor pieces and get down to an endgame. In fact, there's enough pressure on Black's position. White is threatening to bring another rook over to the c-file and try and inflict some damage over here, that Black decides to trade off the knights even. Knight takes, bishop takes, maintaining a blockade on that pawn. And now bishop to b6, going after the perhaps awkwardly placed rook. And now a very clever idea is played here. If you want to take a minute and pause the video and think about this one, this is a good kind of tactics quiz for you. What move does White have at his disposal here? Well, I'm going to give the answer away now. I don't know if this is a tactical element, but it's also a positional move. He just can play the move rook d1, and this is what he did, just supporting the bishop. And if the bishop takes, this is what happened actually. The bishop takes, and bishop takes, and you see he's gotten rid of the minor pieces, and he's traded off. And he's going to get his exchange back. So he can give up the exchange because of this tactic. Let's see. After rook d1, there's other tries. Say if Black were to just develop his rook to get out of this skewer, the potential skewer there with the bishop, then this rook can drop back to c3. And he still has control of this file, and he's got the rook here ready to retake the bishop, and that's the point. This rook has pinned the e-pawn, so it can't take back. But if we were to back up to the original situation here before rook d1, when Black played this bishop move, what he was expecting was for the rook to drop back, and then he could trade off the bishop, and that would bring the pawn forward, and then this would be a dead even position with the two pawns locked up in the center. So that's what this move rook d1 is avoiding. It's avoiding that exchange, being able to retake with the rook here when the bishop takes the bishop. So anyway, that's why he went ahead and took the rook here. It's as good a move as any. Bishop takes. Now the queen has to get out of the way. It goes to e5. Bishop takes f8. King takes f8. So part one of the operation is complete. White has gotten rid of the minor pieces. He's left Black with the isolated queen's pawn. He's prevented it from advancing, and now he's just going to operate against it with the heavy pieces. And there's a pretty simple plan to go after this pawn. If he can just blockade it by putting a rook there, and then get the queen behind the rook, and then just advance the e-pawn, he's going to simply be able to win that pawn. And there's very little that Black can do about this plan. So White starts right away, puts the rook on there. On the square blockading the pawn, Black plays g6 here. Cancel that. g6. Okay, I was looking at the wrong side of the board. g6, giving the king some luft. And White continues with b5. Now this move was criticized. It's a bit of a mistake to trade off these pawns. If we get into a king and pawn endgame with rooks, rook and pawn endgame, I should call it, and these queenside pawns are gone, and White wins this pawn, it'll be 4 pawns against 3 pawns, all on one side of the board, which is a theoretical draw. So it's a bit of a mystery why Black played the move b5 here. But there are some concrete reasons, I guess. So an alternative here would be to play a move like queen d2, though, and just try and ratchet up the pressure and leave things alone. But you'll see after b5, Black wants to take. He wants to get rid of these pawns, and it gets White's queen to a very active spot, so it's going to help him rounding up this pawn here. But the queen goes to c7. It's got to defend the b pawn, and this pawn is hanging, I guess. Let's see. He just played queen back to b2. Let me take a look at. I don't understand why he didn't just take the pawn here. Yeah, he could have just taken the pawn there. Okay. I'm curious about that. Instead, he played queen b2, which actually, I guess he's going to win the pawn anyway, and he wanted to cut down on any nonsense like this queen coming down here and giving a check and maybe disrupting things. So Black takes this opportunity to move his king to a slightly safer square, getting it away from some checks. Now the queen goes to d2, and now we've got this kind of ideal configuration lined up against the pawn and just threatening to play the e-pawn to e4 and win it. So at this point, Bronstein was recommending the counterattacking move, Rook a8. This is kind of an interesting try. Rook a8, and just giving up on the pawn immediately. Rook takes a3. That pawn is a goner anyway. And then Rook to d8 check. Maybe this is a little bit scary. The king goes to g7. Queen d4 check. King h6. And this is playable, apparently. It's a little bit nerve-wracking. I think after Rook g8, Black starts to get in trouble. Yeah, maybe that line was an example of something that doesn't work out so well, because it seems like Black is in trouble after that. So in this position, Black played queen c5, holding on to the pawn for a bit longer. a4, advancing the a pawn, and just restraining this b pawn. That's going to be the next target. Also, the queen hit the pawn, so the queen coming forward defended this pawn and hit the a pawn. The queen goes to a3, continuing to keep pressure on the a pawn. He's offering a trade here. The pawn goes to a5, so the queen holds on to it there. And now Rook to c8, just giving up on this pawn. Like I said, it's gone at some point anyway. It's just a question of deciding when to take it. If queen c5 had been played there, e4 is the move that wins the pawn. So here, White finally grabs the pawn, and Black decides to go in for the endgame with the queen check. So queens come off, and the king goes to g2. And now maybe Gligoric thought that he would keep the pawns on both sides of the board, but these come off pretty quickly. The rook goes to b1, and now g4 is played. Interesting idea, gaining space on the king side here, and keeping, some ideas of Black. Black wants to advance his pawns and try and trade things off to create a simpler configuration, but with the rook and the pawn here, it stops Black's pawns from advancing. As an option, he could have gone in for the immediate rook d8 check, driving the king to g7, going here behind the pawn, and trying to round it up this way. But there's a very neat trick here that is handy to know. The rook comes to the square b5. So the threat, by the way, the threat is that White is just going to push this pawn, and he's going to take advantage of this pin on the b file. That's why I'm showing this trick. There's a way you can handle that as Black. You put the rook right here on the b5 square, and now when the pawn goes forward, you can just take it. You see, the pawn defends the rook, so that's why that b5 square is so important. So the rook goes there and defends. So anyway, no particular advantage to delivering the check there, and this g4 move is the way White has of cramping Black's position a little bit, trying to keep him from advancing these pawns. King goes up to g7, now plays h4, gaining more space. b6. Finally, Black has succeeded in dissolving these pawns. White doesn't have to take immediately, but advancing does not work. I mean, that's the one thing you might try. And just rook a1 is going to round it up. He can't defend it. So so that pawn is a goner, the a pawn on the other side of the board. So White just continues with h5, gathering space over here. And now Black takes, and White takes. So we are in that situation finally where we have the 4 pawns against 3 all on one side of the board. And it is a theoretical draw, and probably with best play, black could still draw this position. But white has a few advantages. He's advanced his pawns, and he's going to bring his king up to support them via some path like this. And with so many pawns, the pawns can actually serve as a shield to the king against checks from black's rook. So black is going to try and stay active and deliver lots of checks and try and slow down white's advance. The general plan for black is if he can just trade off these pawns, you're into a rook and pawn against rook endgame, and that is a draw. You just need to set up a Philidor position with your king in front of the pawn and the rook on the third rank. So you try and hold off these pawns as long as possible. You deliver as many checks and harassing moves as you can, and then as the pawns come forward, you trade them off, and that's black's plan for drawing. White's strategy for winning is to advance this e-pawn if he can, and the ideal situation would be to have the rook on the 7th rank pinning this f-pawn and then advancing the e-pawn. And if he can achieve that, he can get a win. So these two grandmasters, they're not ashamed to play on in a situation that's a theoretical draw. It's still complicated enough and interesting enough that it's worth playing out. So white starts with the move. It's black's move here. White just took. So black drops his rook back to b7, and white pushes on with g5. And this move is maybe technically a mistake, but like I said, this position is a draw anyway. The line here that's given as best by the chess engine gives something like this: king to g3, f6, trying to hold things off, king to f4, stepping forward, rook to c7, g5, pushing the pawns forward now, fg, king takes, h6 check. And this is a nice trick, driving the king back rather than retaking the pawn right away. The king drops back to g4, rook c4 check, and now f4, and then g5. And the whole point of this is to try and dissolve enough pawns that black can hold the endgame. Every time a pawn comes off, black's drawing chances improve. But this still has some edge to white in it, and is maybe the best play for both sides. Probably still drawn in the end. So Gligoric has a different plan. He pushes on with g5 immediately. And so black takes off a pawn here, happy to get rid of one pawn. And this is a pawn sacrifice. White is not planning to take that pawn back, but he's using this sort of disorganization of black's pawns. Now the number of pawns is even, but they're somewhat they're not able to support each other. They're not well coordinated. So he plays rook to a6, cutting the king off from defense of the h-pawn. So he can at some point bring his king up and round up that pawn perhaps. Rook to b3 was played here, just putting some pressure on the b-pawn. This maybe gives some advantage back. Let's see, rook e7 was the recommended move as the best way to try and keep pressure on this e-pawn and keep it from advancing. So it's not quite as effective to attack it from the side. After this move, let's see, rook h6 was played. Okay, I was looking at that and I couldn't figure it out. Swinging the rook across the board. A nice move. It just keeps the king blocked in, and it keeps this pawn from advancing, which is important because that will prevent it from trading off against this pawn. And also, if this pawn ever advances, the rook will just take it. So the rook is holding back these two pawns while white gets the rest of his army in position. Okay, so the rook stays on the third rank here, attacking this pawn. King goes up to g3. Rook drops back to, goes forward to a1 so he can check from behind. Pawn goes forward to e4. So kind of a slow motion rolling. Now he starts the harassing checks. King comes to f4. Rook to h1, supporting this pawn, which is just hanging. The e-pawn marches forward once more. And now h4, maybe a mistake. it's hard to say. But after this, white gets some edge. What's the best way to try and hold this? Maybe rook to f1 is this recommendation of the chess engine. So you move the pawn forward, rook back to h1, king to f5. I mean, the king is coming forward and making progress anyway in this kind of inchworm fashion. And then rook to a6, getting out of the box and allowing pieces to come forward. Also trying to set up this pin along the 7th rank. Rook to b1 now. Rook a7, rook b6, trying to stop it from the 3rd rank. So that is maybe the best defense, leaving this pawn here, and perhaps black could hold that way. Instead, black decided to go for some counterplay, a perfectly understandable decision, push the pawn forward. And now Gligoric's plan is really starting to pay off. His king goes over to g4, putting pressure here, and also getting out of the way of the f-pawn. Rook to g1 check, king goes forward, and rook to h1, back to the pawn, king g4. Okay, they're doing a little dance. It's on move 46 here, so they may have just needed to get some time on the clock. Although they didn't have increment in those days, so I'm not sure. Maybe he was thinking about whether he could. He was making some moves while he was thinking or something. Rook to h1. So after that little repetition, white finally decides to go ahead with f4, figuring that he can stop this pawn in time. Definitely a very risky way to play, but well, it looks like it's pretty strong for white as well. Looks like this pawn is going to be able to be stopped. But you can understand also why black is playing this way. He wants to get some counterplay here with the h-pawn. So let's see how it plays out. King to g4, attacking the pawn. The rook goes to g1 check, and now king to f3, not taking the pawn, but this pawn in a way, as long as it's not becoming a queen, it's actually acting as a shield and keeping black's rook out of the game to some extent. So rook f1 check, delivering the check to the king. King goes to g3, rook g1 check, king goes to f2, and that's the square he was aiming for. Now the rook has to move, can't deliver another check, so it goes over here to h1, holding on to the pawn. And now this rook comes over to f6, preparing to push some of these pawns forward. The rook goes to a1, the king goes to g3, rounding up the h-pawn. Rook goes back to h1, or threatening to. King goes to g4, king to g8. So now the black king is in kind of a zugzwang. It can't come forward. It doesn't want to go back, but if the pawn were to be pushed forward at this point, well, you see something like this happening later in the game. Just turns out it's there's no good moves for black, so he just drops the king back. Rook to h6, putting pressure on the h-pawn again. It's forced forward. He's trying to avoid that move. And now king g3, hitting the pawn, and there's really nowhere for it to go. Check, and king takes h2, and he's finally rounded up the h-pawn. Now rook to g4, keeping the king cut off, and this is maybe what Euwe was playing for, and putting pressure on the f-pawn, but white can defend it with rook f6. So he's gotten his pawn back, he's still a pawn ahead, and black's position over here is very precarious. And I think this is perhaps no longer a theoretically drawn position. White has improved his position enough that this may be outright winning, although it's hard to say. So anyway, king g7, getting his king back. King h3, chasing the rook away. Rook drops back to g1. And now king h4. So the king needs to get back into the game. Rook h1 check. King to g4. I wonder if it was possible here just to try and stay like this. Just try and keep the king out of the game. Nah, e6 immediately is already an idea here. Okay, so we'll see something like this in the game. He gives rook h1 check. King comes over to g4. Rook g1 check. King goes up to f5. and now rook f1. That keeps the king from moving forward by putting pressure on the f-pawn. So the rook goes over to the side. King drops back to f8. The rook is sort of ideally placed, and they're running out of moves once again. Rook c8 check. King goes back. Rook d8. Grabbing control of the d file. And so this rook stays on the f file, goes to f2. Rook to d1. Taking another square away from the rook. And so now white's strategy is going after this rook. The rook is limited to 2 squares. The rook goes to f3. The king goes to e4, hitting the rook. And now the rook is completely chased off the f-file. Well, it can go back to f2. I take it back. King to e3. And now the rook is chased off the f-file and runs over here to a2. And then the move f5 is played. So that was the point. The rook on the f-file was keeping this pawn from advancing. So white goes through this elaborate maneuver with the king and the rook combined to take away squares from black's rook and chase it away and then advance the f-pawn. The rook goes to g2, getting behind the g-pawn. And the rook goes to d7. He doesn't need the g-pawn anymore. He's now got this pin on the f-pawn that he's been trying for, and he's ready to push on with e6. Black takes the pawn. There really was nothing better. At this point, it really is losing. If he had tried king f8 instead, then the move f6 is a killer because it comes with the threat of checkmate. That's the problem when you get pushed back so much. All these new threats appear with threats of checkmate and things like that. King e8, rook e7 check. King has to go back to f8 because otherwise he's losing that pawn. Rook comes out here. King e8 again because of the threat of checkmate. Rook b8 check drives the king away, and then rook here going after the pawn. Another very typical maneuver when there's a lack of space. The rook is going to just round up that f-pawn, and there's no way that the black king could stay in touch with it with the various threats that white had. So anyway, let's go back to the game. He went ahead and took on g5 right away. Like I said, everything is losing at this point. White doesn't push the pawn immediately, but advances first with king to f4. Rook runs away, and then he pushes on with e6, taking advantage of this pin here. There's some more checks. King e5, check. King d6, check. Oh no, he plays h5 here, trying to get something else going. Another check, and the king would just go in front of the pawn anyway. So rook takes f7 check. King drops back to g8. King e7, getting in front of the pawn, so there's no more checks. And at this point, Euwe resigned. So a very nice endgame, and it just goes to show that just because a position is theoretically drawn doesn't mean that it's easy. And it's okay to play these positions on, see what you can get out of them. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed that one. For round 22, like I said, there were 4 decisive games, including a win by Reshevsky and a win by Smyslov. So they were tied at the end of round 21, and they're still tied now. Reshevsky and Smyslov are neck and neck after 22 rounds at 13.5 points each. Bronstein has fallen off the pace a bit. He only drew in this round, so he's at 12.5. And Keres is half a point behind at 12 points. So those are the 4 tournament leaders after round 22. Stay tuned for coverage of round 23. See you then. Bye.